The operations room at Army Group Center headquarters near Smolensk maintained an atmosphere of exhausted determination in late July 1941 as senior German staff officers compiled situation reports documenting another week of intense combat that had achieved impressive tactical results. Soviet forces encircled, territory captured, advances measured in tens of kilometers, yet had also revealed patterns that troubled the professional military men, who understood that operational success had to translate into strategic decision within timeframes that Germany's multi-front commitments and resource constraints made essential. General Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, stood before the situation maps, studying the symbols representing German divisions that had advanced hundreds of kilometers from the Polish border in 5 weeks of continuous operations, had destroyed entire Soviet armies in massive encirclement battles, and had captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners in what appeared to be vindication of Wehrmacht operational excellence and validation of the Blitzkrieg doctrine that had achieved stunning victories in Poland and France. But as Halder absorbed the details of the latest intelligence assessments, reports documenting Soviet units appearing in numbers that exceeded pre-war estimates, evidence that Soviet industry was producing tanks and aircraft at rates German planning had not anticipated, and most troublingly, the recognition that despite catastrophic losses, the Red Army showed no signs of the imminent collapse that Barbarossa planning had assumed would follow the destruction of Soviet forces in border battles. He experienced the cold realization that would progressively spread through the German High Command over the following months. The war in the East would not be concluded quickly, as Operation Barbarossa's timeline assumed. Germany was committed to a prolonged campaign against an enemy whose resources and resilience had been systematically underestimated. And the strategic situation that Germany faced was transforming from a manageable challenge requiring operational excellence into an existential threat requiring resources and sustained effort that exceeded Germany's capacity to provide, while simultaneously defending against Britain and preparing for potential American entry into the conflict. The German High Command's realization that the war would be long emerged gradually rather than through a single moment of recognition, shaped by the accumulation of evidence throughout the summer and fall of 1941 that contradicted the assumptions underlying Barbarossa planning and that revealed fundamental miscalculations about Soviet capabilities, about the timeline required to achieve decisive victory, and about Germany's capacity to sustain major operations across the vast spaces of the Soviet Union while maintaining positions and commitments in other theaters. The recognition came at different times to different officers, depending on their positions, their access to intelligence, and their willingness to acknowledge that planning assumptions had been wrong. But by December 1941, when German forces had been driven back from Moscow's approaches by Soviet counteroffensives, and when winter conditions were creating catastrophic supply and equipment failures, the realization was becoming universal among professional military officers capable of objective assessment. Germany had committed itself to exactly the kind of prolonged, multi-front war that strategic planning had been designed to avoid, and the prospects for achieving decisive victory through military means alone were diminishing as the correlation of forces shifted progressively against Germany. The first indicators that the campaign might not proceed according to plan appeared within days of Barbarossa's launch, though their significance was not immediately apparent to commanders focused on the tactical and operational successes that characterized the invasion's opening phases. The border battles that destroyed multiple Soviet armies and that captured over 300,000 prisoners in the Bialystok-Minsk encirclements demonstrated Wehrmacht operational superiority and validated the decision to concentrate armor in panzer groups that could achieve deep penetrations and rapid encirclements. But German intelligence officers noted that the destroyed Soviet forces represented only a portion of the Red Army's strength, that substantial Soviet forces had escaped the initial encirclements and were retreating eastward in varying states of organization, and that Soviet resistance in some sectors was fierce despite the tactical hopelessness of their situation, patterns that suggested Soviet forces would not simply collapse once subjected to military pressure, but would continue fighting even when rational military calculation suggested surrender was the only sensible option. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center and responsible for the main thrust toward Moscow, sent assessments to OKH throughout July that mixed professional satisfaction with tactical achievements and growing concern about the operational implications of what those achievements were revealing. The encirclement at Smolensk in mid-July destroyed another Soviet army group and advanced German forces to within 400 kilometers of Moscow. But the battle consumed 2 weeks of intensive combat and revealed Soviet capabilities to organize defensive positions and counterattacks, despite the catastrophic losses they had suffered in the border battles. Von Bock noted that Soviet forces were fighting with determination that exceeded expectations, that they were employing tanks in numbers that intelligence had suggested they did not possess, and that the pace of German advance was slowing not because of declining German capabilities, but because of the mounting challenges of sustaining operations across extended supply lines, while simultaneously reducing encircled pockets that continued resisting rather than surrendering promptly. The logistical situation that emerged in July and August provided some of the clearest evidence that the campaign timeline was unrealistic and that prolonged operations would create challenges that German planning had not adequately addressed. The assumption that Barbarossa would be completed within months had shaped logistics preparations in ways that made sustained operations across vast Soviet spaces extremely difficult. The railway gauge difference between European and Soviet systems created bottlenecks at the frontier, where supplies had to be transferred between different rolling stock. The primitive state of Soviet road infrastructure meant that vehicles advancing across unpaved roads consumed fuel and suffered mechanical breakdowns at rates that planning had not anticipated. And the distances involved meant that even when supplies could be moved forward, they arrived in quantities insufficient to sustain the operational tempo that rapid victory required. General Adolf Heusinger, Chief of Operations at OKH and responsible for coordinating Army Group activities, compiled assessments in August that documented the progressive degradation of German combat power even as forces continued advancing and achieving tactical victories. German divisions that had begun Barbarossa at full strength were now operating at 60 to 70% of authorized personnel due to casualties that exceeded replacement flows. Tank strength in panzer divisions was declining from combat losses and mechanical failures that could not be adequately addressed in field conditions. The Luftwaffe was suffering aircraft losses that, while absolutely sustainable, were degrading operational capabilities because maintenance and supply challenges in primitive Soviet airfields meant that serviceability rates were declining even when aircraft were not lost to combat. Most troublingly, the cumulative effect of these various degradations meant that German forces were becoming progressively weaker even while continuing to advance, creating a situation where achieving objectives became more difficult precisely when those objectives needed to be achieved quickly if the campaign was to be concluded before winter. The intelligence arriving at Wehrmacht headquarters throughout August and September about Soviet military capabilities and industrial production revealed systematic failures in pre-war assessment that had shaped Barbarossa in fundamentally flawed ways. German intelligence had estimated total Soviet tank strength at around 10,000 vehicles before the invasion, and had assumed that destroying this force through the initial encirclements would eliminate Soviet armored capability. But by late summer, German forces were encountering Soviet tanks in numbers that exceeded these estimates. The reality was that German intelligence had dramatically underestimated Soviet pre-war tank strength, and Soviet industry was producing tanks at rates approaching 1,000 per month, even while factories were being relocated to avoid German advances. The T-34 tank that German forces began encountering in significant numbers during the summer represented another dimension of intelligence failure and planning inadequacy. German assessments had assumed Soviet equipment would be inferior to German weapons, and that any qualitative advantages would favor German forces. The T-34 challenged these assumptions with armor that German anti-tank weapons struggled to penetrate, with mobility that exceeded German tanks in Soviet terrain conditions, and with a gun that could destroy German armor at ranges that made tank combat dangerous for forces that had expected qualitative superiority. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief military adjutant and commander of OKW, struggled throughout the summer to reconcile the optimistic situation reports about tactical successes with the troubling indicators about campaign duration and resource requirements that strategic assessments suggested. The tension between Hitler's insistence that the campaign was proceeding successfully and the professional military assessments indicating serious problems created a situation where Keitel was caught between his role as loyal subordinate, reinforcing Hitler's confidence, and his responsibility to provide accurate strategic assessment. The debate in late July and August about operational priorities revealed fundamental disagreements about how to proceed once it became apparent that Soviet resistance was not collapsing as quickly as planned. Hitler ordered the diversion of forces from Army Group Center's drive toward Moscow to support operations in Ukraine, leading eventually to the massive Kiev encirclement. The military professionals, particularly Halder and von Bock, argued that concentrating forces toward Moscow offered the best prospects for achieving decisive victory before winter, because Moscow was the political capital, the transportation hub, and the symbolic center whose fall might trigger broader Soviet collapse. The Kiev encirclement in September, which captured over 600,000 Soviet prisoners, was tactically brilliant but strategically costly. By the time German forces resumed the Moscow offensive in October, Operation Typhoon, autumn rains had turned roads into mud, and winter was approaching rapidly. The operational success at Kiev thus ensured that Barbarossa's primary objective could not be achieved in 1941. The resumed drive toward Moscow initially achieved success at Vyazma and Bryansk, pushing German spearheads to within 80 kilometers of Moscow by mid-November. But autumn mud immobilized vehicles, Soviet reinforcements strengthened defenses, and winter conditions neutralized German mobility advantages. General Heinz Guderian, commanding the 2nd Panzer Army, reported tanks freezing in temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius. Lubricants solidified, engines would not start, weapons malfunctioned, and soldiers lacked winter clothing because planning had assumed the campaign would end before winter. The Soviet counteroffensive in December 1941, supported by divisions transferred from the Far East after intelligence suggested Japan would not attack the USSR, drove German forces back from Moscow. At that moment, the realization became undeniable. The war would not be short. Germany was committed to a prolonged campaign in the East against an enemy whose resources, population, and industrial capacity exceeded what Germany could defeat quickly. The outcome would not be determined by tactical brilliance, but by the brutal arithmetic of industrial war. And that arithmetic increasingly favored Germany's enemies.